The hole in the ground. In the summer of 1795, 3 young men rowed across Mahone Bay toward a small, wooded island off the coast of Nova Scotia. The sun was bright that morning, though a fog clung stubbornly to the shoreline, the kind that dulls sound and makes the world feel half asleep. The island had no name worth remembering. Then, just a patch of wilderness the locals called Oak Island, for the trees that stood like sentinels across its slopes. One of the men, Daniel McGinnis, was the first to see it, a patch of earth near the southern edge that looked unnaturally disturbed. The ground sloped inward in a perfect circle, 10 feet wide, its edges marked by strange depressions where the soil had compacted as though something heavy once stood there. A single oak tree leaned over the hollow, its branch bearing what appeared to be the remnants of a wooden pulley, half buried in moss. It looked, in every way, like a forgotten construction site or a grave. Curiosity outweighed fear. McGinnis and his friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, began to dig. The soil came up softer than expected, packed in even layers as if deliberately replaced. 2 feet down, their shovel struck wood, a flat board fitted tightly across the pit. They pried it loose, revealing more soil below, dark and damp. The scent of old timber and seawater rose from the hole. Beneath another layer of earth, they found yet another platform, identical to the first, spaced roughly 10 feet apart. It was the first sign that whatever lay beneath had been built with intent. The boys worked until dusk, stopping only when the light failed and the fog thickened around them. As they prepared to leave, they heard it, a faint hollow echo rising from the pit, rhythmic as though something far below was moving in response to their digging. McGinnis leaned closer, lantern trembling in his hand. The sound faded. Later, he would insist it had been the tide resonating through underground rock. Yet years afterward, he would still wake in the night remembering that sound, a slow, deliberate knock every few seconds, coming from beneath the ground. They returned days later with new tools and a plan. 10 feet deeper, they found another layer of timber, then another. Each board was precisely cut, aligned, and sealed with clay. Between the timbers were traces of charcoal and putty, materials used, they realized, to waterproof ships. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep whatever was buried here dry. By the time they reached 30 feet, they could dig no further. Water began to seep through the soil, thick and cold, rising faster than they could scoop it out. The air turned heavy, and the walls of the pit began to collapse inward. They abandoned the site, promising to return with help. But that night, when they looked back toward the island from the mainland, they swore they saw a faint glow over the treetops, as though lanterns burned deep underground. Word spread quickly through Chester and Lunenburg. Some said it was a pirate's cache, the long-lost treasure of Captain Kidd or Blackbeard himself. Others whispered it was something older, a vault built by the British during the Revolution, or a secret order guarding relics from the old world. To most, it was just a story, but to McGinnis and his companions, it was an invitation. They returned the following spring with new men, ropes, pulleys, and the naive confidence of treasure hunters. The island was different then, quieter, the birds absent, the wind muffled. The old oak still stood over the pit, its shadow stretching across the clearing like an hour hand. They began to dig again, unaware that the deeper they went, the closer they came to triggering a mechanism that had waited undisturbed for centuries. According to local accounts, the moment they struck the fourth platform, the air itself seemed to change. The soil trembled faintly, and a rush of cold wind escaped the pit, carrying with it a smell of salt and decay. Someone swore they heard water moving beneath the ground. Another claimed to see the branches of the oak shiver, though the air was still. They filled the pit and left it untouched for months. But the story refused to die. The island had revealed its first secret, a hole that led nowhere, yet promised everything. In the years to come, that hollow in the ground would draw hundreds more. Engineers, soldiers, millionaires, scientists, each certain they could outsmart the island. And every one of them would learn the same lesson. Oak Island never gives without taking something back. The Money Pit. When Daniel McGinnis returned to Oak Island the following year, he was no longer a curious boy, but a man obsessed. He had gathered a small group of investors, merchants, and shipwrights from Chester, and together they formed what became known as the Onslow Company. Their goal was simple: to dig deeper into the pit that had haunted McGinnis's thoughts since that strange summer day. By June 1796, the pit was already infamous among locals. Skeptics called it a fool's errand, a hole chasing shadows. But the company's men arrived with shovels, pulleys, and the determination of those convinced they were standing atop a fortune. Each new layer they removed revealed deliberate craftsmanship: compacted soil, then a wooden platform, followed by a thin layer of charcoal and clay. At every 10 feet, the same construction appeared again: timber sealed with pitch, designed to keep moisture at bay. At 90 feet, they struck something different: a smooth stone slab covered in strange markings. None of the workers could read the symbols. It was taken to the surface and displayed at a nearby tavern for weeks. Later interpretations suggested it read, 40 feet below, 2 million pounds are buried. But even then, some claimed the markings changed each time they looked at them, as if the stone refused to give up its secret. The discovery fueled the team's resolve. They dug faster, working through nights by lamplight, ignoring the groans from the walls as the pit deepened. The men joked that the island was fighting back. By the 10th platform, the air grew thick with humidity, and the sound of trickling water echoed faintly from below. At 98 feet, the pickaxe struck wood again, but this time, the board gave way with a hollow thud. Beneath it, they heard the unmistakable splash of water. Within hours, the pit began to flood. The men scrambled to bail it out, forming a human chain with buckets, but the water rose faster than they could empty it. By morning, the pit had filled completely, dark, cold, and still. They returned with pumps, but every attempt to remove the water failed. The tide seemed to obey no natural rhythm, rising and falling independent of the sea. An engineer later theorized that hidden flood tunnels fed the pit from multiple directions. Designed to protect whatever lay below, the notion stunned the team. If true, it meant the pit was no accident. It was a machine, one built centuries earlier by minds that understood both geometry and deception. Undeterred, the Onslow Company dug adjacent shafts to bypass the floodwater, only to find each one flooded the same way. As if the island itself were alive and reacting, some men quit, fearing the curse that had already claimed rumors among the villagers. Others pressed on, driven by greed or faith. One night, McGinnis himself descended into the pit with a lantern, peering into the black water. When he returned, he said nothing. He only stared toward the horizon and whispered, "It's deeper than we can measure." The expedition ended that winter, bankrupt and defeated. Yet the island remained, silent, watchful, as though waiting for the next generation to continue the dig. And they would. The Money Pit had claimed its first victims, not through death, but through obsession. From that day on, Oak Island was no longer just a place. It was a question that refused to be answered. The curses begin. By the early 1800s, the legend of the Money Pit had spread far beyond Nova Scotia. Every port town along the coast whispered its story. An island that devoured treasure hunters whole. But for the men who worked the pit, superstition was a luxury they couldn't afford. They came armed with pumps, ropes, and the stubbornness that only gold could inspire. The Truro Company took over the dig in 1849, armed with better technology and deeper pockets. They drained what they could, carving secondary shafts to intercept the water. At first, it seemed to work. The pit's level dropped several feet, revealing the rotted remains of the lower platforms. When they struck another wooden layer at 98 feet, the workers cheered until a dull groan rose from below, like the earth exhaling. A heartbeat later, the water surged back with such force it snapped the ropes and drowned the pumps. That was the first recorded failure of many. Each time they removed water, the island replaced it, faster, stronger, colder. Engineers traced the flooding to the ocean itself, somehow feeding into the pit through natural or artificial tunnels. Divers sent into nearby coves reported seeing streams of bubbles rising from the seabed, as though the island were breathing. Then came the first death. A worker named John Campbell descended into one of the side shafts to secure a loose beam. Minutes later, the men above heard a muffled cry. When they pulled him up, his face was pale, eyes wide open but unseeing. The doctor could find no injury, no drowning, no poison, no cause. The priest who blessed the body simply said he heard something that was not meant for him. From that day on, the talk of a curse took hold. Old fishermen refused to sail near the island after sundown. Locals claimed to see faint lights flickering between the trees, moving against the wind. Dogs howled whenever the pit was mentioned. The Truro Company persisted, convinced that fear was the enemy, not fate. But even the most practical among them began to wonder whether they were digging through more than earth. In one attempt, they built a massive coffer dam to block the ocean water. It held for 2 days before a storm tore it apart. When the tide receded, the shoreline revealed strange geometric patterns carved into the rocks. Triangles, crosses, and arrows pointing inland toward the pit. No one admitted to carving them. Some believed they were markers left by the original builders. Others thought they were warnings. Records from that year mention another unsettling phenomenon: tools disappearing overnight, only to reappear arranged neatly beside the pit, cleaned and sharpened. The men joked that the island had hired its own caretaker. But when one of the shovels was found embedded upright in the center of the clearing, its handle scorched black, the laughter stopped. As the years went on, the accidents grew more frequent: collapsing tunnels, broken pulleys, sudden sicknesses. The curse became legend. 7 must die before the treasure would reveal itself. By the time of the 6th death, nearly a century later, the pattern was undeniable. Each new attempt ended the same way, with the island taking something in return. One night, an engineer named Robert Restall, exhausted from weeks of failure, stayed alone at the site. He wrote in his journal that he could hear the ocean breathing through the roots of the trees. At dawn, he was found lifeless near the edge of the pit. The last page of his notebook was wet, but the ink still visible. It moves when we do. From then on, the money pit wasn't just a mystery. It was a living thing, and the curse wasn't a rumor. It was a contract. The island had made it clear. Every secret uncovered would be paid for in kind. Even today, locals claim that when the wind is right, you can still hear the faint clatter of chains and the echo of shovels striking wood. Repeating every 71 seconds, the heartbeat of Oak Island, still waiting for the next soul to dig too deep. Victorian Gold Rush. By the mid-1800s, the legend of Oak Island had crossed the Atlantic. Newspapers in London and Boston printed headlines like "The Hidden Gold of Nova Scotia" and "The Pit That Swallows Men." Investors saw not a curse, but opportunity. In 1861, the Oak Island Association was formed, a coalition of engineers, financiers, and adventurers determined to succeed where the Onslow and Truro companies had failed. They arrived with steam-powered pumps, reinforced scaffolding, and the confidence of empire. Their goal was to drain the money pit once and for all. The site buzzed with machinery and men, the clatter of pistons echoing through the trees. For the first time, Oak Island sounded alive in a different way: metallic, mechanical, human. Workers drilled new shafts, linking them in a grid meant to isolate and control the flooding. It worked for a while. The water level dropped to its lowest point in decades, and spirits soared. Some even claimed to hear hollow spaces opening below, like caverns sighing in relief. At 88 feet, they struck a new barrier of wood and concrete. Unlike the earlier platforms, this one appeared to be sealed from below. The drill cut through something soft, then metallic. When the bit was raised, fragments of gold chain clung to the edge. The men erupted in cheers. The newspapers declared victory. The treasure was close, so close they could almost feel the weight of it in their hands. But Oak Island has always been patient. 3 days later, without warning, the pumps began to fail. The pressure gauges spiked, valves jammed, and water surged upward with a violence no engineer could explain. Within hours, every shaft was flooded. The men barely escaped with their lives. When divers examined the tunnels, they discovered that the collapse was not random. Each wall had crumbled inward in a perfect spiral, sealing the core of the pit like a closing iris. It was as if the island wanted to bury itself, wrote Foreman Joseph Linton in his report. His notes ended with a final line: "The water is thinking." Still, the association refused to give up. They built cofferdams, imported new pumps from England, and even consulted naval architects. Each new plan seemed sound until they set it in motion. The tunnels shifted, machines seized, and strange gases hissed from the cracks. At night, the men claimed to hear knocking beneath their barracks, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone or something was digging back. When the final pump exploded in 1864, the sound was heard miles away. The pit filled again, deeper and darker than before. The association declared bankruptcy within the year. Its investors returned to London, their ledgers empty, their reputations stained. But the legend had grown richer. Now Oak Island was not just a mystery, it was an adversary. Local lore says that after the last men left, the island stayed unnaturally quiet for weeks. Then, one foggy morning, fishermen offshore claimed to see a faint column of mist rising from the clearing straight up, narrow as smoke from a chimney. It pulsed 3 times, paused, then vanished. Whether it was a trick of the tide or something else, no one returned to the pit for nearly a generation. Oak Island had buried its secret again, and now, it seemed, it knew how to keep it. The Cipher Stone. By 1865, Oak Island was quiet again. The tools had rusted, the camps had rotted, and the pit lay hidden beneath a tangle of vines. Then, decades later, a new team arrived, engineers from Halifax, sponsored by a banker named Frederick Blair. He had grown up on the stories of the island's curse, but unlike others, he saw not superstition, but design. He believed the pit was part of something far larger, a network of tunnels built to protect a message, not treasure. Their digging soon unearthed something extraordinary. At a depth of 90 feet, the men struck a slab of fine-grained stone unlike any found in Nova Scotia. It was smooth, rectangular, and carved with a series of symbols arranged in clean rows. No one could read them. The marks resembled a mixture of Latin shorthand, geometric signs, and nautical charts. The slab measured roughly 3 feet long and weighed nearly 200 pounds. The workers hoisted it to the surface, where it caught the light with an odd sheen, almost metallic. When washed, the inscriptions became clearer. 40 characters carved with precision that suggested a craftsman, not a miner. The symbols fascinated Blair. He sent copies to scholars in Boston and London, but none could identify the alphabet. One coded translation, offered by a linguist named Wilkins, read, 40 feet below, 2 million pounds are buried. Others dismissed it as coincidence. Still, the phrase spread, cementing the myth. Locals soon called it the Cipher Stone, and it became the centerpiece of Oak Island's growing legend. Visitors came to see it, touching the carvings as if they might feel the meaning beneath their fingers. One visitor claimed the stone hummed faintly when struck with a hammer. Another insisted that drops of moisture formed on its surface only at night, as if it sweated when no one was watching. In 1893, the stone was taken from the island and displayed in a building owned by a Halifax merchant named Creighton. Within weeks, strange events followed. Tools misplaced, ledgers rewritten, and workers claiming the basement echoed with the sound of dripping water, though it was perfectly dry. A year later, the building was sold. The stone vanished. Blair searched for it obsessively, believing it held the key to the entire island's riddle. He tracked rumors of its appearance in museums, private collections, even Masonic lodges. One account placed it beneath the floor of a Halifax bank vault. Another claimed it was ground into dust during renovations. To this day, its whereabouts remain unknown. Modern historians argue that the cipher stone's disappearance was no accident. Some believe it was deliberately removed by the very group that buried the treasure, its symbols a kind of trap. Others say it was taken by those who finally understood its message and decided it was safer kept secret. But the stone left behind more than myth. It introduced the idea that Oak Island's secret wasn't gold at all, but information, knowledge encoded in layers of earth, symbols, and design. Engineers began to wonder, what if the island itself was a map? What if every failure, every collapse was not sabotage, but instruction? As one local historian put it years later, the island doesn't want to hide something. It wants us to look, but only in the right way. The flood tunnels. By the dawn of the 20th century, Oak Island had already consumed the fortunes and reputations of a dozen men. Each generation came armed with better tools and new science, yet all met the same enemy: water. It wasn't ordinary flooding, but a deliberate system that behaved like a living organism, anticipating every attempt to drain it. The island didn't just hold water, it used it. In 1897, Frederick Blair and his engineers conducted a survey of the island's perimeter. What they discovered defied explanation. At Smith's Cove, they found 5 stone drains buried beneath the sand, arranged like the fingers of an open hand stretching toward the sea. Each drain was packed with coconut fiber, material that had never existed naturally anywhere near Nova Scotia. The fiber acted as a filter, allowing water to flow freely into an underground system of tunnels leading directly toward the money pit. When they excavated further, they discovered a complex lattice of box drains and clay-lined channels extending deep into the island's substructure. The engineering was astonishing. Precise angles, consistent gradients, and a network that could only have been designed to flood the pit on command. It was, as one engineer put it, an automatic defense mechanism built centuries ahead of its time. The realization changed everything. The treasure hunters were no longer digging into a mystery. They were trespassing into a machine. Every board removed, every layer breached, triggered a reaction somewhere else. The island was built not just to conceal, but to punish curiosity. Attempts to block the water began almost immediately. Workers filled the drains with clay and stone, sealed cracks with tar, and even poured quicklime into the channels. Nothing worked. Within days, the sea punched through their barriers, flooding the pit with renewed fury. One night, a sudden geyser erupted from the ground 50 yards from the main shaft, cold seawater mixed with sand, bursting upward in a violent surge. The men fled, convinced the island itself had come alive. Blair hired divers to explore the lower tunnels, but none could navigate the narrow passages. Their lights vanished in the murky depths, swallowed by silt and darkness. When one diver resurfaced, gasping for air, he claimed he had seen carved stonework, steps descending further into the island, perfectly smooth and impossibly deep. He refused to return. His report ended with a single line: "It breathes down there." The discovery of the flood tunnels spawned dozens of theories. Some believed they were built by pirates using naval engineering stolen from the Spanish Armada. Others pointed to the Freemasons or the Knights Templar, whose symbols appeared in carvings found near the island's shore. A few even suggested that Oak Island was hiding not treasure, but something meant never to be unearthed. A secret buried so well it needed the ocean itself as a lock. In 1905, a last desperate attempt was made to cut off the flooding for good. Crews dynamited sections of the beach, collapsing part of the drainage network. For a brief moment, the pit went dry. But the victory lasted less than an hour. The ground shuddered, and a deep, resonant boom echoed across the island. Water began to pour in from above, not from the tunnels, but from the very soil, rising like sweat through the earth. The pumps exploded under pressure, and the pit filled once again. That night, witnesses along the coast claimed to see the sea around the island glowing faintly blue, as though reflecting light from below. The men called it phosphorescence. The locals called it a warning. For the first time, even the most rational minds began to accept what the island had been trying to say for a century. Whatever sleeps beneath Oak Island, it has no intention of being found. The death toll rises. By the early 20th century, Oak Island's mystery had turned deadly. Generations of men had dug, drained, and dynamited their way toward the truth. But the island's defense never faltered. The deeper they went, the higher the cost. The legend of the curse, once a fireside story, was now written in blood. The first major tragedy came in 1897. The Halifax Company, eager to resume Frederick Blair's work, sank a new shaft adjacent to the money pit. For weeks, everything went smoothly. The pumps ran day and night, and the water seemed to recede. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the tree line, the ground beneath the main platform shuddered. A low moan echoed from below, followed by a rush of air that extinguished every lantern at once. Seconds later, the floor gave way. Two men plunged nearly 60 feet before the shaft flooded in an instant. Only one body was recovered. The survivors described the sound as the pit inhaling. The loss shook the expedition, but greed and pride proved stronger than fear. Within a year, new investors arrived. They brought steel reinforcements and dynamite, determined to collapse the tunnels feeding the pit. The explosions rocked the island, splitting trees and sending plumes of black mud skyward. For a moment, it seemed the curse had been broken. The water subsided, and the men cheered. But that night, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, a strange vibration pulsed through the ground. The sea around the island began to churn, though the wind was still. When dawn came, the pit had refilled, this time with sand, gravel, and a foul, brackish foam. The pumps jammed instantly. One mechanic who touched the residue described it as alive, like skin breathing. He left the island that same day. In 1909, a syndicate led by Franklin Roosevelt, then a young lawyer with a fascination for maritime legends, funded another excavation. Roosevelt himself never set foot in the pit, but he followed every report. The work progressed until a gas leak erupted from the shaft, igniting and killing two men. Witnesses swore the fire burned blue, not orange. The next morning, the ashes in the pit were still wet. The deaths multiplied over the decades: drownings, collapses, suffocations. Each new name added to the list deepened the island's reputation. Locals began to say that 7 lives must be taken before the treasure would reveal itself. By the time the 6th man died, no one laughed at the prophecy anymore. In 1965, during one of the most ambitious digs in Oak Island's history, the Restall family, Robert, his son, and 2 crewmen, descended into a newly discovered shaft near the money pit. Without warning, they were overcome by hydrogen sulfide gas seeping from the earth. One by one, they collapsed. Rescue attempts failed. 4 men died before anyone could reach them. It was the single deadliest event in the island's history. The newspapers called it the pit's revenge. In the aftermath, the curse hardened into doctrine. 7 must die before the treasure will rise. To this day, 6 have perished. The island still waits for one more. Even now, visitors to Oak Island claim to hear strange sounds at dusk: the clang of metal, distant voices, the steady rhythm of shovels striking wood. Sensors placed near the money pit record faint vibrations every 71 seconds, identical to those detected a century earlier. Engineers insist it's natural resonance. The locals shake their heads and say the island is counting. No one knows if the curse is real or superstition. But every time another dig begins, the same thing happens. Machines fail, lights flicker, and the sea grows strangely still. As one surviving diver put it, "You don't find Oak Island, it finds you." The Smithsonian Connection. By the 1950s, Oak Island had transcended folklore. It was no longer the playground of dreamers and diggers, but a scientific enigma. The new generation of treasure hunters came armed not with shovels and superstition, but with sonar, seismic equipment, and geological training. And for the first time, the world's most respected institutions began to take notice. In 1958, samples of the island's soil, timber, and metal fragments were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The results, released publicly, were mundane: iron oxide deposits, natural fissures, and organic decay. Yet privately, several engineers on the project reported anomalies they couldn't explain. Metallic traces inconsistent with any known alloy of the 18th century, and wood carbon dated hundreds of years older than the earliest settlers of Nova Scotia. According to an internal memo leaked years later, the Smithsonian quietly forwarded the materials to a government research facility in Maryland for further classification. No follow-up data was ever made public. Meanwhile, the island itself began behaving strangely again. Magnetic readings fluctuated violently. Compasses spun at the same points along the southern shore, always in intervals of 71 seconds. Geologists mapping the island noted unnatural voids beneath the surface, perfectly geometric chambers that didn't align with any known fault lines. When they drilled near one, the bit descended cleanly through 70 feet of clay before striking what felt like hollow metal. When withdrawn, it carried up fragments coated in a dark, oily residue that corroded within hours of exposure to air. The discovery prompted the involvement of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Under the guise of an archaeological survey, they conducted a classified sonar study of the area between the Money Pit and Smith's Cove. The final report was never published, but one photograph, later leaked by a technician, showed a structure deep underground, cylindrical and ribbed, resembling part of a massive vault. Its walls appeared too smooth, too precise to have been carved by hand. When questioned, the Corps denied any involvement, yet their equipment remained on the island for months. Local fishermen recalled seeing lights moving across the water late at night, as if small craft were ferrying equipment to and from the shore. Around the same time, one of the leading geologists on the project, Dr. Malcolm Armitage, disappeared. His notes were recovered from his tent, pages filled with sketches of what he described as mechanical strata. Layers of metal plates, arranged like the ribs of a lung. His final entry read, "It's not a tunnel, it's a chamber that breathes." 2 days later, his campsite was found empty. The official report listed him as missing, presumed drowned. The Smithsonian's involvement was quietly erased from subsequent publications. Requests for information returned with the same answer: no records found. But one surviving technician, interviewed decades later, confirmed that the artifacts sent to Washington were sealed in a crate labeled Nova Scotia Vault Series 3. He claimed that when he opened the box for cataloging, it contained not soil or wood, but a small, curved metallic plate etched with faint symbols identical to those from the lost cipher stone. He said it hummed when touched. If true, the discovery meant Oak Island wasn't just a place of hidden wealth. It was a design system, built with materials and precision far beyond the reach of its supposed creators. And someone, somewhere, had been keeping that fact a secret: the hidden blueprints. By 1966, Oak Island had become more than a dig site. It was a riddle etched into the landscape itself. After decades of excavation, engineers began to realize that the tunnels, chambers, and shafts weren't random at all. Their alignment followed patterns, angles, and ratios that echoed sacred geometry. It was as if someone had built the island as a code. ... The The revelation began when archivist Eleanor Ward of the Nova Scotia Historical Society uncovered a series of 17th century maritime charts in a forgotten drawer at King's College. One map, drawn in iron gall ink and labeled Nova Terra Crypta, depicted an island bearing an uncanny resemblance to Oak Island. But what caught her attention wasn't its shape, it was the annotations. Around the edges were symbols nearly identical to those on the lost cipher stone, along with a faint compass rose that pointed not north but toward magnetic anomalies found on the modern island. When Ward overlaid the old map on recent aerial surveys, the match was perfect, down to the cove inlets and ridgelines. Even more unsettling, the tunnels beneath the money pit aligned with constellations visible from Nova Scotia during the summer solstice of 1497. Whoever designed the system had used the stars as their blueprint. Mathematicians brought in to analyze the map discovered that the main shafts formed a pentagram when connected by straight lines. The central intersection of that star fell precisely where the deepest drilling had always stopped, at 200 feet. The odds of such coincidence, they concluded, were nearly impossible. Further study revealed that each arm of the pentagram pointed toward a landmark: Smith's Cove, the swamp, the Nolan Cross, and two lesser-known sinkholes near the northern shore. Together, they formed what appeared to be a vast geometric design etched into the island itself. When the pattern was compared to ancient architectural layouts, Chartres Cathedral, the Temple of Solomon, and even the Pyramids of Giza, the proportions matched. The team dubbed it the Blueprint Hypothesis. According to this theory, Oak Island was not merely concealing something underground, it was the something. A monument in code, a message left by builders who measured in centuries. Among the recovered documents was a cryptic note written in archaic Latin: Clavis sub mare ad caelum ducit. The key beneath the sea leads to the heavens. The handwriting matched that of a known 17th century stonemason associated with the Rosicrucians. His journal, preserved in part in London, spoke of a northern vault where knowledge sleeps beneath salt and sand. No one had connected the reference to Oak Island until now. Engineers soon tested the theory with ground-penetrating radar. The scans revealed something astonishing. Beneath the money pit lay a massive circular cavity, its edges smooth and symmetrical, like the dome of an inverted cathedral. At its center, faint reflections suggested the presence of metal beams arranged in a radial pattern, identical to the geometry of the pentagram above. The data hinted at intelligence, deliberate design spanning surface, substructure, and even the island's position relative to the coastline. One researcher described it as a message you have to stand on to read. And then came the strangest discovery of all. The geometric center of the island, long thought to be natural, lay exactly at the golden ratio between its north and south edges. No mapmaker of the 1600s could have measured with such accuracy. To believers, it was proof of something ancient. To skeptics, it was coincidence. But even they couldn't explain why, when standing at that precise center, compasses refused to settle, as if the very earth there pulsed with its own magnetic rhythm. As historian Ward later wrote in her unpublished memoir, "It is no longer a pit we are digging into, but an idea, one that was buried long before our nation was born." The curse deepens. By the early 1970s, Oak Island had evolved into a battlefield between reason and superstition. Every new discovery seemed to confirm that something intelligent and perhaps ancient lay beneath the surface. But the more the scientists tried to explain it, the stranger the island became. The Lagina brothers, engineers by trade, installed advanced geophysical sensors across the island. They expected to find stable readings of magnetic and seismic activity. Instead, they found chaos. Magnometers spiked erratically every 71 seconds, the same rhythm first recorded a century earlier. Ground vibrations pulsed in perfect intervals, as though something beneath the earth was beating like a heart. The team assumed faulty wiring, but the equipment checked clean. They replaced batteries, recalibrated frequencies, even relocated the sensors. Each time, the same result: identical pulses, synchronized across all instruments. One night, while reviewing data, geologist Mark Franklin noticed something chilling. The spikes didn't just repeat, they responded. Whenever his team drilled, the pattern changed. When the drills stopped, the rhythm slowed. When they approached the old money pit, it accelerated. It was as if the island was listening. At first, they joked about it. Then, equipment began to fail in ways no one could explain. Motors burned out overnight. Cameras malfunctioned, producing static filled with ghostly silhouettes, shapes that moved even when the lenses were covered. One technician reported hearing a deep metallic hum rising from beneath his feet, like a generator buried underground. Moments later, his compass spun wildly and cracked down the center. When they checked the recordings, the hum was gone, but a faint whispering remained on the audio track, a pattern of frequencies too regular to be random. Audio specialists who analyzed the file claimed it contained harmonics consistent with human speech, slowed to 1/15th normal speed. When accelerated, the phrase was almost intelligible. Not yet. Fear began to divide the team. Some wanted to stop immediately. Others believed they were closer than anyone had ever been. They drilled deeper, reaching 180 feet before the bit struck something solid. The vibration that followed was unlike anything they had felt. Steady, rhythmic, deliberate. Water surged into the borehole moments later, flooding the shaft and short-circuiting every power line on site. In the days that followed, strange phenomena multiplied. Animals avoided the island. Metal tools left overnight rusted in perfect concentric circles. A diver reported seeing flickering lights under the water near Smith's Cove, like reflections from torches moving below the surface. When sonar scans were taken of the area, they revealed something horrifyingly precise: a perfect sphere, 20 feet in diameter, suspended in a chamber of air. Its surface reflected sonar signals like polished steel. Then came the incident. While retrieving core samples, technician Andrew McKinnon collapsed without warning. Witnesses said he froze mid-step, staring at the pit before falling unconscious. His pulse was erratic, matching the exact rhythm of the island's seismic pattern. When he awoke hours later, he couldn't remember anything except a single phrase he kept repeating: "It's not buried, it's waiting." After that, the project shut down for several months. Equipment was packed away, reports sealed. The official explanation cited electromagnetic interference and gas exposure. But privately, the men knew better. Oak Island wasn't just a tomb. It was aware, and every time they dug closer to its heart, it seemed to breathe faster. The disappearing evidence. The following year brought silence and then confusion. When the Oak Island project resumed, nothing was the same. Files were missing. Equipment logs had vanished. Even the topographical maps stored in Halifax appear to have been replaced with older, incomplete versions. It was as if the island itself had reached out and erased its own story. The Laginas, frustrated but undeterred, returned with new funding and digital recorders. They documented every hour, every measurement, every anomaly. But within days, the footage began to glitch. Frames blurred into static, timestamps looped backward. One camera, left running overnight, captured a full hour of footage, except when they played it back, the first 20 minutes were gone. The file didn't corrupt, it simply stopped existing. Technician Sarah Connors, responsible for data storage, described what she saw when she opened one of the drives. The folders were still there, but they were blank, not deleted, emptied, like someone had reached in and scooped out the content. The timestamp still showed activity at 3:17 a.m., the exact minute when all the island's power systems had simultaneously failed the previous night. More troubling was what remained. Some of the surviving files were subtly altered. Notes were written in fonts and syntax no one recognized, yet they referenced measurements the team had indeed taken. In one altered document, a single line appeared beneath the official report header: "We correct the record." No one admitted to typing it. Hard copies fared no better. Several notebooks used by divers and geologists began to show smudged ink, not from moisture, but as if the handwriting itself had changed. A diver's journal that once detailed sonar readings now contained entirely different notes, written in a curved, deliberate script that no one on the team recognized. The text was faint, but one sentence stood out. "The truth is not lost, it is buried again." Archivists in Halifax confirmed that similar discrepancies had appeared in official records. Photocopies of the original cipherstone translation had been swapped for fakes. Even the Smithsonian correspondence, once public, was removed from library archives. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act came back with the same response. No documentation found under this title. Forensic specialists examined the deleted hard drives and concluded that the erasures couldn't have been done manually. The drives showed no signs of remote access or malware, yet entire blocks of memory had been overwritten with repeating binary patterns, sequences of ones and zeros that, when converted to ASCII, spelled two words: "Forgive us." The disappearances extended beyond data. Several artifacts collected during earlier digs, wood samples, fragments of chain, and a section of the mysterious metal plate were missing from the museum storage facility in Halifax. Security footage showed nothing. The curator responsible for their safekeeping later claimed that when he opened the vault, the shelves were covered in fine, dry sand, as if the objects had crumbled into dust. The most unsettling case involved Dr. Franklin himself. While reviewing his field notes, he realized entire passages were gone. Where once he'd written technical details, there were now blank spaces. Yet the indentation of the pen remained, as though he had written words, then they had simply been lifted from the page. He described it as memory decay made visible. The more they searched for missing information, the more they began to question what they still remembered. Conversations recalled differently, events that none could prove. The past itself seemed to be eroding. In the end, they stopped documenting altogether. The data, they said, would only vanish again. Whatever controlled Oak Island didn't just guard its secret, it controlled the narrative itself. And for the first time, even the skeptics whispered the same thought. Perhaps the curse wasn't about gold or glory, but knowledge. Knowledge too dangerous to be remembered. The map beneath the water. When the island itself began erasing its own story, the team turned to the sea. If Oak Island was protecting something, perhaps the key wasn't buried under its soil, but beneath the waters that surrounded it. In 1975, a joint expedition between Canadian naval engineers and private researchers launched Project Mirror. Its goal: to map the seabed around the island using high-frequency sonar. The initial scans showed standard coastal formations, sand shelves, kelp beds, and coral debris. Then, on the third day, the sonar picked up a shape that froze the entire control room. Beneath the southern shoreline, at a depth of 60 feet, lay a pattern too symmetrical to be natural. An enormous outline, identical in shape to Oak Island itself, but mirrored, as if a second island existed below the surface. The anomaly measured exactly the same length and width as the island above, complete with ridges and depressions that corresponded to known features on land. Even the position of the money pit had a twin below. When the sonar data was processed into a 3D model, it revealed more: a network of arches and channels radiating outward from the central cavity, like spokes from a wheel. At the heart of this underwater mirror lay a perfect circle, smooth, domed, and metallic in composition. Divers were sent down in reinforced suits equipped with floodlights and pressure sensors. The descent was slow, the visibility poor. At 40 feet, the water turned opaque with silt. Then, through the murk, they saw it, an archway of black stone rising from the seabed, half buried in sand, covered in coral. It was no natural formation. The blocks were carved, interlocking with precision, each marked with shallow grooves, forming a pattern of intersecting lines. When one diver brushed away the sediment, he revealed a symbol, 5 overlapping circles, identical to the pentagram geometry discovered on the island. Moments later, his wrist monitor spiked with electromagnetic interference. The sonar feed in the control boat flickered, then went black. When contact was re-established, the diver's camera captured something even stranger. At the base of the archway, nestled between the stones, was a metallic sphere about the size of a human head. It reflected light perfectly, even underwater. The diver reached out to touch it, and the feed cut again. He resurfaced minutes later, gasping for air, his equipment dead. When they replayed the last few seconds of audio from his helmet mic, they heard a deep, rhythmic thud, 3 beats, then silence, followed by his voice whispering, "It's the same pulse." Subsequent dives were canceled. The water near the anomaly became strangely warm, as though heated from below. Instruments left at the site recorded consistent low-frequency vibrations emanating from the circular structure, pulses identical to those detected under the money pit decades earlier. The two sources, land and sea, were in perfect synchronization. A geophysicist later remarked, "It's like the island is breathing, and the ocean is breathing with it." Project Mirror's final report was sealed, marked confidential, defense relevance. When copies were requested years later, they were told the documents had been archived and declassified for destruction. No one ever saw them again. But the legend spread. The locals began to call the phenomenon the Drowned Twin, a phantom reflection of Oak Island beneath the waves, alive and moving in tandem with the cursed ground above. Those who believed said it proved what they'd suspected all along. The treasure of Oak Island was never meant to be unearthed, because it wasn't buried. It was alive, watching from below the surface, its heart beating beneath both land and sea. The Guardian Signal, the discovery beneath the sea, changed everything. Oak Island was no longer just a riddle. It was an organism, pulsing in harmony with something deep and unseen. But the next revelation would prove that whatever slept beneath the island wasn't just alive, it was intelligent. And weeks after the Project Mirror dive, the research vessel Ariadne anchored near Smith's Cove to continue monitoring seismic and electromagnetic activity. At precisely 2:14 a.m., all instruments simultaneously recorded a burst of energy unlike anything they'd seen before. It wasn't random static or geological noise. It was patterned, rhythmic, deliberate. The transmission lasted 12 minutes. It repeated every 71 seconds, mirroring the mysterious pulses long detected in the island's soil. But this was different. It carried structure. The amplitude rose and fell in increments of 3, followed by a pause, then 2 shorter spikes, then 1 long tone. When plotted on a graph, it formed a perfect triangular waveform, mathematically precise. At first, the team dismissed it as interference from naval communications or atmospheric reflection. Yet when they checked frequencies across the region, they found nothing else transmitting at that wavelength. The signal seemed to originate from directly beneath the island itself, roughly 200 feet below the money pit. Curious, engineer Paul Henley fed the data into a spectrogram. The pattern revealed something chilling. When converted into sound, the frequency modulations resembled a human voice, not words, but a steady hum that rose and fell as though breathing. One technician described it as a chant underwater. Over the next few nights, they monitored the signal. Each time it repeated with small variations, enough to suggest adaptation. On the 4th night, linguist Dr. Marie Delcourt noticed a peculiar detail. The variations matched Morse intervals, though too rapid for manual code. When slowed to 1/10 speed, the pulses translated into 3 repeating letters, O-A-K. The coincidence stunned the team. When they tested the hypothesis aloud, speaking the word oak near the receiver, the signal changed frequency for the first time. The long tones shortened, aligning with the rhythm of the spoken syllables. It was as if the island had heard them. They repeated the experiment with other words, treasure, pit, water, but only one caused a reaction, oak. Each time it was spoken, the frequency spiked sharply, accompanied by a low subsonic rumble that shook the recording equipment. The reading showed the vibration originated from beneath the island's geometric center, the same point marked centuries earlier by the cipher stone alignment. Later analysis of the recordings by cryptologists revealed another layer. Within the modulated carrier wave was a faint mathematical progression, a Fibonacci sequence repeating endlessly before resetting. It was not random and not natural. The discovery left the researchers divided. Some believed the signal was man-made, a centuries-old mechanism still operating autonomously. Others, less willing to say aloud, suspected it was something far older, something aware of them. Henley, who had been the first to decode the OAK pattern, became obsessed. He stayed awake for days, tuning into the signal manually. In his last recorded note, scribbled in the margins of a logbook, he wrote, "It's not calling for us. It's calling something else." The next morning, Henley was gone. His bunk was empty, his headphones still humming faintly with the same steady tone. The ship's sonar that night recorded one last transmission, 3 long pulses, then silence. They called it the Guardian Signal. And though it has never been detected again, every modern reading taken on Oak Island still shows one anomaly at its core, a faint, persistent vibration, repeating once every 71 seconds. The same heartbeat, still there, waiting. The final excavation. By the early 1980s, Oak Island was exhausted. A century and a half of digging had left its landscape scarred and hollow, its myths buried beneath layers of steel and mud. But a new consortium of engineers, funded by private investors and shadowed by quiet government observers, announced what they called the final excavation. They promised to end the mystery once and for all. Satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and thermal sensors mapped the island in unprecedented detail. The data was shocking. A central void almost 200 feet wide stretched beneath the island's geometric center, an exact match to the breathing chamber detected decades earlier. It was smooth, spherical, and metallic. Whatever it was, it had been sealed perfectly for centuries. The operation began at dawn on May 4th. Flood barriers were installed, and a steel platform erected above the money pit. A vertical drill fitted with a diamond-tipped bit was lowered into position. Every rotation was monitored by 3 computers, all synchronized to record seismic feedback. As the bit descended, the readings remained normal until it hit 90 feet. Without warning, the instruments began to pulse. The drill's torque meter flickered erratically. Operators reported a faint vibration rising through the ground, rhythmic and slow. On the monitors, the waveform appeared, 3 short beats, 2 long, 3 short again. It was the Guardian signal. The engineers hesitated, but orders came from above. Continue. At 120 feet, the bit struck something solid, metallic, unyielding. The sensors screamed. Pressure readings spiked off scale, then stabilized. When the drill was withdrawn, the tip glistened with a dark film that shimmered like oil but clung like mercury. It corroded the steel within minutes. The team lowered a probe camera. The feed showed a narrow shaft leading into a hollow space. Dust floated in zero gravity, like ash suspended in water. And then the lens caught it, a flash of light, like reflection from polished metal deep below. For 3 seconds, the camera's image distorted, the signal warping into static, before the feed cut completely. At the same moment, the entire island trembled. A sound rose from beneath the pit. Not an explosion, not machinery, but a low, sustained moan that rolled through the soil. It was the sound of pressure equalizing, air moving through ancient chambers. The ocean around the island churned violently, waves rising without wind. The waterline along Smith's Cove dropped 6 inches, then surged back. The workers scrambled to shut down the equipment, but one refused. Geologist Dr. Lewis Carver, who had spent 20 years studying the island, leaned over the shaft and shouted into the darkness, "What are you?" For a moment, nothing. Then the ground exhaled, a gust of warm air so strong it knocked him backward. Sensors lit up with radiation spikes, followed by electromagnetic interference that fried every device on site. Witnesses claimed that during those few seconds, the earth beneath the pit seemed to pulse, literally rise and fall, like the slow movement of lungs. A photographer snapped one blurred image before the power failed completely. A column of mist rising from the shaft, faintly luminous, twisting as if alive. The entire island went silent. The hum stopped. The heartbeat that had persisted for generations ceased altogether. For 12 hours, the pit remained open. No one dared approach. When the sun rose the next morning, the shaft had collapsed. The drill platform was gone, swallowed whole, leaving nothing but a circle of blackened earth that smelled faintly of salt and ozone. The official report listed the event as a catastrophic ground failure. But those who were there told a different story. They said the island hadn't failed. It had defended itself. That it had waited until they touched its heart, and then it closed itself forever. No one has drilled that deep since. The island sleeps again. For weeks after the collapse, the island was silent. The sea calmed. The air cleared, and the strange vibrations that had haunted Oak Island for generations vanished. Birds returned to the trees. The tides returned to their rhythm. Even the magnetometers, which had once spun erratically, now held perfectly still. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Government inspectors arrived within days, sealing off the site under the guise of environmental safety. The remaining crew were ordered to leave. Equipment was confiscated, and all communications from the island were restricted. The official statement read simply, "Operations suspended indefinitely due to ground instability." Within months, the media lost interest. The legend, once roaring across headlines, faded back into rumor. But for those who had been there, the silence was worse than the noise. Dr. Lewis Carver, who had shouted into the pit moments before it collapsed, left the island in a daze. He retired to the mainland and refused all interviews. Neighbors said he spent his days sketching spirals in his notebooks over and over, the same pattern that once marked the island's pentagram geometry. He spoke rarely, but when asked about the final moments, he would whisper, "It answered." Others from the team reported subtle but disturbing after effects. Watches stopped working when worn. Compasses refused to point north in their homes. Some described dreams of being underwater, breathing easily, surrounded by light that pulsed like a living heartbeat. One diver wrote in his journal, "I think part of me never left that hole. When the ground closed, it kept something." Months later, local fishermen began to notice a faint glow beneath the waves near Smith's Cove on moonless nights. It came and went without pattern, sometimes white, sometimes a dull crimson. The Coast Guard dismissed it as bioluminescent algae, but those who lived nearby knew better. They called it the island's breathing light. A year after the event, a new magnetic anomaly was recorded, not on Oak Island, but 40 miles east beneath open water. The signal was weak but familiar, a slow, deliberate pulse, once every 71 seconds. To some, it was proof that the island's secret had simply moved, shifted deeper, farther from human reach. To others, it was a warning, a reminder that the thing beneath Oak Island wasn't meant to be contained. It had simply gone back to sleep. When historians look back on the saga of Oak Island, they speak of greed, obsession, and tragedy. But those who were there, the last generation of diggers and dreamers, know better. They say the island was never guarding a treasure. It was guarding balance, a mechanism designed not to be solved but to test those who tried. And every few decades, when another team arrives with new tools and new theories, the same story begins again. The hum returns, the ground trembles, and the sea grows restless. Oak Island breathes once more. Perhaps that is its true curse, not that it hides gold or secrets, but that it remembers, and it waits. In the end, one truth remains unshaken through centuries of failure and loss. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to survive us.